Hey you guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we're talking about where bass go in the winter and how to catch them. Bass in Highland reservoirs, Lowland reservoirs, ponds, natural lakes, rivers. They behave a little differently in all of those different environments. And today we're going to take a look at why. Winter fishing can be amazing. Some of the biggest bass of the entire year are caught in December. Frankly, they're caught all the way through the winter. But it starts now. Those really big ones become targetable. They're no longer random catches mixed in with smaller fish. This is such a great time of year, but it's also really cold. I mean, in some places it's frigid cold, so you don't want to be out there wasting your time either. Understanding where the bass are positioning, how they're eating, why they are there, and simple baits, simple techniques that you can use to target them effectively is everything. Again, you don't want to be out there wasting time searching in the freezing cold. If you're going to be out there, you want to be doing some fish catching. So that's what we're talking about today. Where do these fish go? And let's talk about it in the different environments, because I think that's critical. If you can recognize the type of fishery that you are on, whether you're on a pond, a river, a lake, a reservoir, what kind of reservoir, if you can identify that for yourself, what is your home fishery, then we can really quickly help you narrow in on where you want to be fishing in those places. Let's start with lowland reservoirs. Okay, so a lowland, what's the difference between a highland and a lowland reservoir? Well, Highland reservoirs tend to be much narrower, much steeper, have much longer fingers, lots of points and offshoots coming off them. So if you look at your lake on a map or you look at it on Google Earth, if you see sort of a narrow canyon type lake, a skinny dam, a narrow dam, and these little offshoot fingers with coves going off of all of those, that is a highland reservoir. A lowland reservoir is quite different. The dam tends to be very wide. There may be more than one dam. There might even be 2, 3, 4, 5 dams to hold that water in, because the reservoir tends to be shallower overall. Often they are very rolling contours, both underwater and around the lake, not those steep canyons. And you'll see these arms, but often when you go into those arms, they open up. They're not just narrow little canyon fingers coming off of that main body. So a lowland reservoir is really a unique environment because they are often quite shallow, even out in the middle, which means the bass have almost endless places that they can be. And if you are not catching fish and you're aware of that, it is incredibly overwhelming, because you turn around, you look at that vast open water, and the whole thing might only be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 feet deep. If it is, bass quite literally could be anywhere. So how do you break that down? Where do you start? What should you be looking for? In a lowland reservoir, there's a couple of places that I'm going to look. The first one, as we get into the middle of winter, those fish will tend to be in the open basin. If you've got a really good dam, a riprap dam that you have access to, fishing the face of that dam can be really good. If the water's not that deep in front of the dam, you know, say less than 50 or 60 feet, fishing out away from the dam, out in front of it, can be really good too. From there, I like to go, because again, I want to narrow this place down. I'm gonna look at my map, and I'm going to go up to, if there are offshoots in the lake, you know, creek arms that go off, I'm gonna go to the mouth of each one of those creek arms, and I'm going to fish the points on both sides of it. That is a key place where if bass in the fall were chasing bait back in those arms, but the arms are relatively shallow, as it gets really cold, the bass will pull out to the mouths and they'll set up on those points. The other thing that you can look at if you've got really good electronics, good mapping, is to take a look for underwater humps or harsh bends in the creek channels that run out in the open water. Anywhere that you've got a harsh turn in that creek, bass will set up there. It doesn't matter if it's 10 to 15 feet deep, 30 to 40 feet deep, it does not matter. That's all viable this time of year. All you need to do is go out and check a few of those. And if you notice that the ones from 20 to 30 feet seem to have fish on them, the deeper ones, the shallower ones don't, now you're dialed in. You look at your map, you find a handful of others that are similar at that same depth, and you're set. So that's what I like to do in a Highland reservoir. That's where I start my search. I'm sorry, in a Lowland reservoir. That's where I start my search. Now, a Highland reservoir is a bit of a different animal because it is much steeper. There tends to be a lot of really deep water that the fish are not in. They tend to only go so deep, and a lot of it is just below that. So the dam itself can still be quite good. But in a Highland reservoir, I personally, if I'm just going out there blind, I'm looking for what I like to call pinch points, which is going to be narrow places in the lake. So you'll see offshoots of arms going back with points coming off of those. And within all of that, you'll find places where maybe it splits 2 or 3 different ways, and there's big points that come in there where those points narrow the lake down. So you've got a point that comes from the left and from the right, and it's not that far across the middle between them. It might be 200 feet deep between them, but it's not particularly far. Those are key places. Anywhere where the lake narrows down and gets pinched. Again, the mouths of creek arms. Fishing the major main lake points where creek arms come into the main body of the lake, that big main point, that can be everything. And then a lot of times we will have island tops in Highland reservoirs because those big points run out into that lake and they have contour to them. And those high spots are either island tops if they're above water, or they're humps if they're underwater. And fishing the edges of either one of those can be so good. Now, the fish may set up right on top of them at certain times of day, and then they may slide off the side at other times of day. If you're out early and late in the day, they'll often move up a little bit. You can catch them up on the tops of humps or right up near the edge of a point. And then later in the day, that sun gets up high and they'll slide off that edge. So where I like to look for getting even more narrow is take a spot like a main lake point that's coming out between 2 creeks and find where that point is coming up, find where the deep water comes in and tucks right up against it. And that fastest transition from shallow to deep, that's your sweet spot. Again, I'm not on your specific fishery, but I am very confident that I could come to your specific fishery, and if it is a Highland reservoir and I take a day looking for those places, I will catch fish in that lake. Now, for guys that are in ponds and or natural lakes, because they tend to behave very similarly, a 1 acre pond and a 50,000 acre natural lake behave the exact same. One is just doing it over a much larger expanse of water. In natural fisheries, there tend to not be a lot of contours, not a lot of big points with breaks on them, no creek channels. Those things just aren't there because it's just typically a natural bowl that has filled up and debris has settled into it over time and sort of filled up any big contours. So in those fisheries, we will often fish what we call the hollows. And we do this a lot in lowland reservoirs as well. That would be in those shallower fisheries. Take this cove that I'm in right here. If you guys look over my shoulder, you see how flat the contour is of this cove? Now, there's some laydowns and stuff back there. Ignore that, okay? Just see how flat the cove is. If this water was 20 feet higher, the belly of this cove, the gut of this cove is very flat, no contour. The bass would sit right in the center of the gut. They would sit in the center of the hollow. So what I will do in lakes that don't have a lot of contour is I'll look at the contour that is there. Maybe it's a rolling slopes coming around that lake. You know, maybe there are a couple slow rounded points. The space between those 2 rounded points is a hollow. There may be no change in contour whatsoever, but bass will sit in the center point, the lowest point of that hollow. So if your pond is shallow, they will sit in that open, deepest water area. If it's got a dam on it, they're probably out off of that dam. Now, natural lakes, big fisheries, the same exact thing is true, but in those bigger fisheries, there's more options, there's more area for something to maybe be out there. Maybe there's some man-made cover. Maybe people have put out brush piles, you know, things like that. Fish will just pile onto any piece of cover in a natural lake in the wintertime. And then the last thing, here's a trick for you, whether it's a natural lake or a pond, keep an eye out for features on the shore that run out into the water. So that could be anything from, you know, there's a boat ramp coming in and they've poured that concrete edge on that boat ramp, that curb coming in, or that runs all the way out into a natural lake. You better believe fish will sit on the end of that boat ramp. Things like rock veins. So if you're looking down the shore and it's all rocky and then it turns to sand, that transition that you see on the shore will also carry out into the water, and 100% they will live on that transition. If you've got like hard bedrock edges, you know, where sometimes that bedrock will have gotten broken over time and it stood up on its edge, and there's just like a little, you're walking the shore, there's like one little rock vein that you have to step over. That rock vein runs out there, you had better believe they're sitting all over that thing going out across that pond or that lake. So pay attention to the shoreline. Look for any little contour change that might carry out into the water. If you've got a fishery that basically is a bowl with nothing in it, those subtle things are everything. What's that leave us? Let's talk rivers or reservoirs that have current in them, okay? Anywhere that's got a lot of current, the colder the water gets, the more the bass will want to get out of that current. If this is just a small creek or a small river and there's not any offshoots or anything like that, those fish will 100% be sitting in the eddies in the deepest pools. They'll sit, now they might be right next to the fast water, but they're sitting in the calm water where they're exerting the least amount of energy. In a larger river where they have options where they can get out of the current, you know, if they can go into a little creek arm off to the side or a backwater, they will pile into those, and typically they'll treat it just like a hollow. They'll sit in the middle, in the deepest part, right down on the bottom, unless they're feeding. Then they'll rise up and they'll feed. You know, a place like the California Delta, there's a ton of current there. It's tidal, right? So tide water coming back and forth throughout the day, but tons of current. The biggest fish in that system will find places where they don't have to battle the current. They'll be in the dead end sloughs. And then the number one place that I believe is overlooked, and you know, I guided that delta for a long time. Those fisheries, I look for sloughs, not only dead end, because everybody's looking for those, but I look for sloughs where the water is dumping out on an outgoing tide, where the water is dumping out both ends. Because if it's dumping out both ends, somewhere in the middle is the relatively slack water that is only rising and falling. That's all that's happening in the middle while the water's pulling both directions out of there, and that is so overlooked. Some of my best delta spots were those little calm sections in the middle of a slough that's otherwise moving, and everybody is overlooking it. All right, guys, now with that in mind, there are key baits that we use to target these fish. I'll run you through some of those. These are confidence baits of ours, and none of these I don't think will be a surprise to anybody, but this is the time of year where we dial in on these things. And I mean, this is quite literally what will be laying on my deck when I'm going out there and exploring new water. If you need to cover water, it's one of two things. The first one is the A-rig. Okay, if I need to cover water, so say the fish are out in the hollows, and I'm fan casting that stuff, or I'm fishing a bend in a creek arm, but it's a big bend, right? And I'm covering a lot of water. I'm not sure there's anything more efficient than an A-rig. An A-rig has incredible drawing power. You're able to twitch it and pop it and work it to draw a reaction from those fish. It's really effective. You can cover tons of water. You can control speed to adjust to the day. So if the fish are aggressive, you speed it up. If they're not aggressive, you really slow roll that thing. But the A-rig is so deadly. Specifically, this is our mini. So we built 3 sizes of our tactical rig, right? There's that full-size flex rig, then there's the mini, then there's the little micro. The mini and the micro are often what I find myself throwing in winter, the heart of winter in particular, but I always start with that mini because it's a larger profile, larger baits will tend to get that larger bite. The only time I set that down is when they just won't eat it, and I need to downsize. And then if they're chasing big bait, I upsize. But the majority of the time, this time of year, I start with that mini, that medium-sized rig. Whoop. That's what I'll be slinging when I'm just trying to cover water. And then the other one, over the last year and a half or so, has become strolling. Taking that minnow bait on the jig head and covering water. And that is with or without electronics. You know, I've got live, if I've got that on and I'm looking, that's totally helpful. But you fish this so quickly, shaking that rod tip and reeling, that you can cover an incredible amount of water with that thing and find a lot of fish with or without electronics. If you're walking the shore, that is an amazing bait because you can cast really far, you can fish it quickly, and it gets bit. Now, if I've located some fish, so it's either I found them or this isn't my first rodeo. I've been on this lake before, right? You're probably fishing a home lake. You've probably got an idea of where some fish are. Then I've got 2 different approaches to catching those fish. Don't mind my bilge pump. My boat got completely full of water yesterday. Completely full. If you're in a fishery that you sort of know where they are, this 1-2 punch is going to be reaction baits versus, you know, that slower, methodical fishing. And either one of those things can be really effective. It depends, again, on the day. I will always reaction fish first. If I can draw a reaction bite, then I am not reliant on bass to want to bite. Needing a bass to want to bite limits your ability to catch them. That means that they've got to be in the mood. That means that your bait has to look perfect and they have to believe it's real and they have to want to eat it. A reaction bite can just elicit a core feed response in a bass. You know, if they're completely and utterly shut down, sometimes they can ignore it. But the vast majority of the time, if that fish is even remotely in the mood and a reaction bait comes through that's presented properly, they will lash out and respond to that. There's 2, speed cranking and jerk bait. Okay, and these 2 things elicit a feed response in very different ways. The speed crank is exactly what it sounds. It's all about speed. The jerk bait is going to be the complete opposite. I'm about to walk you through why I use these like a 1-2 punch. Speed cranking, I can use it to cover water, no question. But where I really like it is when I've already located fish. I know they're there, and I'm gonna use this thing to try and catch the biggest ones in the mix. Speed cranking, even in the coldest water, is an incredible way to draw a feed response out of a bass. So those bass are set up, and this is our bait. This is the Tactical DD75. We designed it specifically for this. It's not the only bait that can do it, but we designed it to fill some problems and to do this exact thing, and it does it incredibly well. So we burn this bait just as fast as we can go on a 7-to-1 reel or an 8-to-1 reel, even when that water's in the high 30s and 40s, just as fast as we can turn that handle. But you burn, 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 pause, burn, pause, burn, 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 pause. That thing comes flying by those fish so fast, something inside them reacts. It's like a cat and mouse reaction. They have to chase. And the reason that we burn, 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 pause is that they lash out, they start to chase it, and then when you pause, it's right there in their face. They're going as fast as they can, and it just stops. And then they either have to try to stop and turn off, or they commit and they crush that thing. There's no time to analyze whether it looks right. There's no time to analyze whether or not that's real. It's just a full commitment to right in their face, and they're on it. Now, color is key. That's why the Tactical DD comes in so many really natural colors. When this thing flies by, we tend to throw the really natural colors so that they don't get a good look at it. It's just a lot of sound, a lot of vibration, a lot of movement, and they react. It's not until you pause that thing and they're right there on top of it that they even see it. And then it looks right, and it's just a full commitment instantly. That cat and mouse game works. We do this in the coldest water all through the winter, and it is incredible the size of fish that will eat it. I mean, it's unbelievable how big of a bass will commit to it. Now, the jerkbait, that's the other end of the spectrum, okay? Again, we already know where they're at. We're not trying to cover endless water. We're going to take a jerkbait, and we're going to use it to elicit a feed response. The jerkbait, we're gonna rip, rip, pause, rip, pause, rip, 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 pause. I use either 1, 2, or 3 twitches and then a pause, and I just mix them up. See what the fish want that day. But the key here is that the pauses are long. Depending how cold your water is and depending how the fish respond to the bait, I might wait up to 10 seconds between twitches. That's why I spend so much time with that Megabass Vision series. These are incredibly dialed baits. They're very consistent. You need a bait that will hover in the water column long enough and just sit there in front of those fish. So the idea is that you're working that jerkbait and you twitch it over the top of a bass, but then you pause, you stall out. That gives the bass time to respond. So unlike the speed crank just screams by them and they're either gonna do it or they're not. The jerkbait, you work it up over the top of them and then it just stops there. Bass are very aware of things that are in their surroundings, very aware. They don't like things to be in their zone, and they certainly will check them out if they stay there for an extended period of time. So when you pause that jerkbait over a bass, they will tend to rise up to look at it, okay? And the idea behind the pause is that the colder the water, the closer the bass has to be before it's going to react. Remember, we were burning that speed crank and pausing it so that they would almost crash into it. We want them close. Same thing with the jerkbait. If I'm 5 feet over that bass and I only give it a 2-second pause, I twitch, and it's sitting, and that bass starts to look up, I'm still 4 feet away the next time I twitch, and they just let it go. But if I'm on an 8-second pause and that bass is 6 inches from that bait, when I make my next twitch, that reaction, that harsh movement, that's when that fish will feed. They'll lash out at it. Again, cat and mouse. They're sitting there looking and it darts away, they dart after it. But they've got to be close to it already for that to work. So the jerkbait is all about that long pause, that slow cadence. If I could only have one, that Megabass Vision 110 Junior +1, that deeper bill. That +1 just gets down there a little better, hovers over them really well. I like the way that it sits in the water a little bit nose down. It's not flat and it's not way up on end. It's just sort of in the middle. I really like how it sits. Natural colors are key for that long, slow fishing. Natural colors where they can sit and stare at it. The rest of the year, I like a lot of bright, bold colors. You guys know that, but this time of year, I'll start out with those really natural colors. So that's that reaction side of things. At the other end, we've got slowing down, right? Taking your time, slow fishing, it's cold water, dragging bottom. And there's a couple of different things that I do with that with. One is the jig. I love jig fishing in the winter. 1/2 ounce finesse football is my main deal. A finesse football with a Yamamoto double tail grub. That specific trailer And really that specific color most of the time too. Super matte brown, so deadly with that purple in it. It's an incredible color in the winter, but that Yamamoto double tail, those claws are so thin and so soft that they'll continue to have a little bit of motion. Not exaggerated motion, just a little movement, even in really cold water. And that's key. More and more though, we're going smaller and smaller and smaller. You guys have noticed we do a lot of finesse fishing these days. This little guy from Great Lakes Finesse, our little matte finesse jig, that tiny little hook in it. Like I'll put that X-Zone Stealth Finesse Series creature on the back of it. So again, we've got those thin little tails. Look how good that little jig looks. It's amazing. So the deal here, finesse football or true little micro finesse jig, the deal here is we can go to a lot lighter line with these hooks. Bass don't pull quite as hard in the wintertime. We can go to lighter line, we can get more bites. Now, if for whatever reason they don't seem to eat the jig, there's one of two things I throw. This guy, the blade bait. The blade bait is deadly. Bottom hopping a blade, that little vibration. So hop it, let it flutter, and then it'll fall back to bottom. Flutter, fall back to bottom, flutter. But you fish it slow, so it's not like we're covering a bunch of water with that blade. We're just barely fishing that thing. Those fish will react and eat it on days where they won't eat the other stuff. And then last but not least is that tried and true Ned rig, that little finesse TRD. On the days where they are just not having it, they're just not into it, you throw that TRD out there, you let that guy soak dead still. Again, fish know when something is in their zone, and if it stays there long enough, they want it out. It's amazing how well that works. Throwing that little TRD out there on places where you already know there's fish and super slow fishing it, you'll be surprised how it will pick up bites for you when nothing else will. Guys, this is an awesome time of year to be on the water. I love fishing in the winter. I love how peaceful and calm it is. I say as a wake rolls by from another boat driving past me. But seriously, there's way less boat traffic. The lake is calm, it's quiet. Big bass are willing to bite. You can target them this time of year. Get out there and chase those winter bass. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.